One of the issues facing contemporary pragmatism is the objection that it is relativistic. And this is something that Hilary Putnam does not want to succumb to. He fully considers that we can still be pragmatists and realists at the same time, although this is realism with a lowercase r. And as such, he wants to revisit John Dewey to see what his conception of democracy means for the way that we think about ethics. Because Putnam is much more interested than a lot of the other pragmatist philosophers, maybe with the exception of William James, with ethics. Because if philosophy, according to pragmatism, is now to center around the practical effects of lived experience and to reject false problems, well then we're going to be concerned with essentially a democratic conception of human life, which means that ethics are going to be important. As such, we're going to look at Hilary Putnam's A Reconsideration of Deweyan Democracy, where he incorporates a lot of quotes from Dewey that are really interesting for thinking about what pragmatism means for the history of philosophy and the way that philosophy shifts its values and goals, and also for thinking about how Putnam revises Dewey in certain regards. Now, one of the problems that Putnam sees with relativism is that we get to a sort of cultural stultification, where we can have cultures with very different values and no way to exchange those values or contest each other's values. Say, for example, we have Afghanistan right now under the Taliban. Well, Afghani women are oppressed, undeniably so. The woman's voice is aura, so she cannot speak in public. She cannot show her face in public. She cannot go to parks, etc. She cannot go unaccompanied by a male, which is actually fairly common in a lot of Muslim-majority countries. But Putnam sees instances like this, and he doesn't specifically mention Afghanistan, but it's very fitting with what he's talking about, is, you imagine some sort of sexist society where women are oppressed. And you have our society here in the West, and we look at the society and we say, hey, things could be better. If you just knew, for example, that there was a better solution, maybe you'd want it. Now, there are a lot of thinkers that Putnam says would say no. They have their culture, we have ours, and the only reason we value our values is because we grew up on them, because we're in them. Those people have every right to their values and us to ours, and we have no grounds on which to castigate them or critique them. Putnam says that this is not a good way of thinking about the world because it's going to be fundamentally undemocratic. We're going to have these obstinate sort of tribal groups that are not going to be able to talk to each other. And the foundation of intelligence, which is what democracy is going to consist in, is going to be not a transcendental faculty, but, as Putnam says, simply the ability to plan conduct, to learn relevant facts, to make experiments, and to profit from the planning, the facts, and the experiments. This is going to require that we can talk to each other, so that we can interact with the elements in our lives and we can experiment and see what works. We can't just reject something a priori because it's different from us. That's very undemocratic. The best thing we can do in a democracy is we can have differences that can commingle together and negotiate with each other. As such, he says, okay, these thinkers who are the ultra-relativists are really perpetuating the myth of the noble savage. He says that these thinkers are going to say that basically traditional societies are viewed as so superior to our own societies that we have no right to disturb them in any way because they have their values and we have ours. At bottom, the idea is that people in traditional societies are content, that they're not asking for changes, and we have no right to say that they should be asking for changes because in so doing, we're simply imposing a morality that comes from a different social world. So you see how we have these kind of independent solar systems of values that can't talk to each other? Both Dewey and Putnam are wary of this. They say, well, okay, if you mean a sort of paternalistic intervention where you have like a colonialist imposition of values, that's not going to work. Because then we get this sort of heroic mentality. I mean, it's the sort of manifest destiny or the white man's burden where, oh, I guess I just have to come in here and share reason and rationality with them so that they can get better. It doesn't matter whether or not they want it. That is a bad way to think about democracy. This sort of forcible overtaking, a sort of social Darwinist approach. No, instead we need to be aware that we can judge these other cultures, argue with them, and persuade. Because these are not forcible mechanisms. We are merely opening up an intellectual space where alternate possibilities are present, and we can give justifications for those possibilities. Now, if our values continue to disagree so much that even after that justification, they won't adopt our values, then well, we can't really do anything after that. All we can do is hope that we can communicate with each other and change our minds. We do this even within our own societies. And Putnam also mentions that this notion with the noble savage myth that those people, so to speak, are content doesn't actually really matter. Now, why is this? He says, the fact that someone feels satisfied with the situation means little if the person has no information or false information concerning either her own capacities or the existence of available alternatives to her present way of life. The real test is not what women who have never heard of feminism say about their situation. Indeed, it's hard to see how the situation of a chauvinist woman in India is different from the situation of a chauvinist woman in this country 30 years ago, who had never been exposed to feminist ideas. Such women might well have answered a questionnaire by saying that they were satisfied with their lives. But after realizing the falsity of the beliefs on which the acceptance of their lives had been based, the same women not only felt dissatisfied with those lives, but they sometimes felt ashamed of themselves for having allowed such a belief system to be imposed upon them. And that's the key problem. These societies, such as the Afghani society, for example, they have their values imposed on them and do not have the full plethora of ideas available for them to decide over. It's fundamentally unfree. And this sort of fetter to the free exchange of knowledge is something that Putnam sees as one of the problems encouraged by the noble savage myth. And as such, he says that, okay, pragmatism's essence is really testing one's ideas in practice and maintaining an attitude of fallibilism towards them. Right? My ideas could be wrong, but I don't know until I test it. To judge ideas simply on the basis of their ability to resolve difficulties without putting them under strain, without testing them, without trying to falsify them, is to proceed pre-scientifically. In other words, ideas can do all they can in the abstract, but you need to actually butt them up against experience and see what happens. As such, Dewey says that those who support the myth of the noble savage, this sort of protectionist, isolationist, relativist conception of historical interaction and cultural interaction, are really immunizing institutionalized oppression from criticism. The immunizing strategies are different, but they have this in common. They give up the idea that it would be good for victims of oppression to know of alternate ways of life, alternative conceptions of their situation, and to be free to see for themselves which conception is better. And that is what we need to fight against. And Dewey mentions that, for example, we need not have some notion of the good to know what is better or worse for a given society. There are certain standards for human flourishing that can be agreed upon within a society, and on those terms, we can give objective statements relative to a subjective frame about what is best or worst for that frame. And if we can convince each other to change our terms, or to recognize that we are not acting in accordance with our terms, then we've done some progress. Dewey says that philosophy's business is to accept and to utilize for a purpose the best available knowledge of its own time and place. And this purpose is criticism of beliefs, institutions, customs, policies with respect to their bearing upon good. Notice, not the good, but good, a good. This does not mean their bearing upon the good as something itself attained and formulated in philosophy. For as philosophy has no private score of knowledge or of methods for attaining truth, so it has no private access to good. As it accepts knowledge of facts and principles from those competent in inquiry and discovery, so it accepts the goods that are diffused in human experience. It has no Mosaic or Pauline authority of revelation entrusted to it, but it has the authority of intelligence, of criticism of these common and natural goods. So Dewey's saying, look, our societies do have some things in common in terms of what is greater or of lesser benefit to us, right? If we're all humans, we're all going to be perturbed more or less by certain consistent things. And as a result, talking about the good of communities is not to talk about the good with a capital G. It's just talking about a little g good. And we can negotiate this through a democratic approach. And it's important that this brings into the view an approach to equity, which is very important. Dewey writes, a very considerable portion of what is regarded as the inherent selfishness of mankind is the product of an inequitable distribution of power. Inequitable because it shuts out some from the conditions which direct and evoke their capacities, while it produces a one-sided growth in those who have privilege. Much of the alleged unchangeableness of human nature signifies only that as long as social conditions are static and distribute opportunity unevenly, it is absurd to expect change in men's desires and aspirations. And this is very similar to, for example, John Rawls's political theory, where he says that, okay, what's best for our society is that any inequality we have to create should be inequality for the benefit of those least fortunate in a society, because that is the best heuristic towards a tendency of equity, of equality of opportunity, allowing people to express their ideas, fight in their interests, work towards their goals. This is the ideal of a democratic society, is not one of equal outcome. No, it's one that recognizes differences. But he says that Dewey's philosophy can't always do this in the ethics sphere, because we say that, okay, there's some notion of what's good for a certain society or for a certain person, but this has a little tone of rationality in it, right? That I can rationally appraise, objectively appraise, as I said, what is the best outcome. Well, this is not always the case, and Putnam gives the example Sartre gives in Existentialism is a Humanism, namely of Pierre. And Pierre is a French citizen in like 1943 or something, during World War II. And Pierre has a sick mother at home that he needs to care for. But he also has the opportunity to go fight in the war against the Nazis. What do I do? Care for my sick mother or fight for my country against a force of bad for my society, for this world? Which do I choose? Well, Sartre says that, what did I say to Pierre? You must simply choose. You are condemned to be free. In other words, there is no rational, non-circular justification for choosing one over the other. They depend on their own values, and we really can't give a non-value-laden appraisal of which you should choose. There's no objective or purely rational explanation. As such, he says, and this is Putnam, someone who only acts when the estimated utilities are favorable does not live a meaningful human life. For instance, even if I choose to devote my life to a calling whose ethical and social value is certain, say, to comforting the dying, helping the mentally ill, curing the sick, or relieving poverty, I still have to decide not whether it is good that someone should do that thing, but whether it is good that I, Hilary Putnam, do that thing. The answer to that question cannot be a matter of well-established scientific fact, no matter how generously scientific is applied. And this is going back to Pierre and to Dewey to say that, look, there's not always going to be a grounded reason for what we do. We merely have to choose personally, and we have to create a democratic society that furnishes this, which means that equality is not enough. Dewey's going to mention this when he critiques classical liberalism, where he says that the real fallacy of classical liberalism lies in the notion that individuals have such a native or original endowment of rights, powers, and wants that all that is required on the side of institutions and laws to eliminate the obstructions they offer to the free play of the natural equipment of individuals. The removal of obstructions did not have a liberating effect upon such individuals as were antecedently possessed of the means, intellectual and economic, to take advantage of the changed social conditions. But it left all others at the mercy of the new social conditions brought about by the freed powers of those advantageously situated, those in positions of advantage, right? The notion that men are equally free to act if only the same legal arrangements apply to all, irrespective of differences in education, in command of capital, and that control of the social environment which is furnished by the institution of property, is a pure absurdity, as facts have demonstrated. Since actual, that is, effective rights and demands are products of interactions, and are not found in the original and isolated constitution of human nature, whether moral or psychological, mere elimination of obstructions is not enough. The latter merely liberates force and ability as that happens to be distributed by past accidents of history. This free, quote-unquote, action operates disastrously as far as the many are concerned. The only possible conclusion, both intellectually and practically, is that the attainment of freedom, conceived as power to act in accord with choice, depends upon positive and constructive changes in social arrangements. In other words, look, our problems are not just because we're not free enough. It's because we don't have the same opportunities, because some people in power have the ability to think and act as they please and others don't. So equality under the law is not enough when fundamental conditions of access, of opportunity, and property are unequal. When people have, as he said, differences in education, in command of capital, in their control of the social environment. This makes it such that when people are freed, the less fortunate are only freed to be more exploited by those whose powers to oppress are now more freed. So what we need for a democratic society is a fundamental social construction that favors those less fortunate and is going to be equitable. That is true democracy. That being said, I hope that this has been helpful in thinking about Deweyan democracy and the way that it's going to implicate itself in the way we think about pragmatism. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap and I'd really appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.